Celebrating 50 years of public broadcasting in Canada. This is CBC Radio.
You're listening to a special weekend of anniversary programming, saluting the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation on 50 years of broadcasting. Happy 50th CBC from Radio Saskatchewan, CBC 540.
The sound of history. 50 years of broadcasting news on CBC Radio. Hello, I'm Rex Loring. I'll be joined by my colleagues who usually host World Report, the World at 6, and Canada at 5. As well, we'll hear from our chief correspondent, Vince Carlin. Instead of bringing you the results of the latest election or breaking news from somewhere in Canada or around the world, the next hour is about us, the CBC Radio News Service. We'll look back at coverage that spans 50 years.
Because for 2.5 years of broadcasting, the news, my first 2.5 years of broadcasting, the news was always bad. You know, I got to be known as the voice of doom, and certainly it seemed at the time that doom was upon us.
This is Matthew Holton of the CBC, speaking from Belgium. At the village of Breen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I declare officially open the Trans-Canada Highway.
Shock and consternation, I believe, that all Canadians have learned of the death of Mr. Pierre Laporte, who was so cowardly assassinated.
We'll examine the advantages and disadvantages of radio news coverage as we compete with newspapers and television.
You notice how we built programs around the news service, whether it's World Reports in the morning, supplemented by regional news in the half hours with a strong morning show around it, or whether it's a World at 6 in the evening, leading into an As It Happens and through the evening. You know, we routed huge chunks of our day. And it's also what makes, I think, CBC Radio distinctive. There is no other national news voice in radio terms in this country as CBC Radio News.
And we'll take a short peek at what may be in store in the future.
We find ourselves very much in the turbulence surrounding the leading edge of all of these technological changes.
The first radio voice broadcast was made by a Canadian, Reginald Fessenden, on December 23rd, 1900. Fessenden had been chief chemist for both Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse. And ironically, the man from Sherbrooke, Quebec, had to get American funding for his invention. It wasn't until a year later that Marconi made his famous transmission from Britain to Signal Hill. During the 20s, lobby groups like the Radio League, aware of the significance of radio, began to pressure the federal government for regulations and creation of a public radio service. In 1932, the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission was created, to be replaced 4 years later by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Leonard W. Brockington was its first chairman.
Good evening. I am speaking to you as chairman of a board of governors of a corporation of which you are at once the shareholders, the debenture holders, and the patrons. I refer, of course, to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which at midnight on Sunday last succeeded the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission in the control of national radio as a Canadian public service. Your new board consists of 9 governors or directors. The corporation is in the main independent of any government department. Its powers are wide and cover every phase of broadcasting, both public and private. Your directors have pledged themselves, one with the other, that they will act as a unit, non-political, non-personal, and non...
When the CBC first became reality, there wasn't a news service as we know it. But indeed, there was news.
Canadian Radio Commission calling the world. Ladies and gentlemen, right in front of us here right now, this moment, the men brought up Dr. Robertson from the pit. He's come up here, been carried along this channel of men, these cheering miners, and he's been placed in this ambulance, and he looks well. He's smiling.
J. Frank Willis reports on the rescue of miners at Moose River in 1936. Also, a disaster in Niagara Falls, as the Rainbow Bridge collapsed into the Niagara River, incredibly without any loss of life.
And we find now that the bridge has drawn away. A great gap extends before us, not 25 feet away from where we're standing. And from that gap has been pulled out the Canadian end of the bridge. The bridge itself did not...
John Canavan describes the bridge's collapse.
All over the ice down in the river. It simply collapsed on its own long axis. Of course, the bridge is a complete and utter wreck. Twisted metal, distorted spars, the old wooden platform broken as of kindling. We managed to get on the air within 7 or 8 minutes of the actual crash. We were hoping, as we were standing by here, that we would get some warning of this impending disaster and that we would be able to be actually on the air when the crash came. There was absolutely no warning.
These were extraordinary broadcasts. Normal news was also broadcast in the early days. The first voice associated with news on the CBC was Charles Jennings.
I had done an awful lot of network broadcasting and had also started to read the first national news bulletin, which I started when the Canadian press supplied us with the copy. And it used to be bicycled up by a messenger boy on flimsy, arriving about 2 minutes to 11. These were the days when the national news bulletin was 11 to 11:15, and sometimes a minute or so late. But the national news, it was really the first big news broadcast in Canada. It was a very important news broadcast. It ran about 12 minutes, and then it was followed by 3 or 4 or 5 minutes of a very detailed weather forecast covering the whole of the country from Straits of Belle Isle right across to the West Coast. And it was scheduled to coincide, or to sign off rather, just before the time signal from Ottawa, which you may recall was the first 4 notes of O Canada. The 4th note was exactly at 11 o'clock, and that came down on a line to Toronto from some very complicated technical device here in Ottawa. That also used to be a bit of a trick to try and end up right on the button, so that when you said that gave the time signal announcement and switched off your microphone, the time signal came through right on the button.
Then, on January 1st, 1941.
We begin today a national news service. Since the start of the CBC, and indeed in the time of its predecessor, the Radio Commission, listeners have been indebted to the Canadian press for the provision of news.
General Manager of the corporation,
Right.
Gladstone Murray.
Warm tribute should be paid now both to the public spirit and to the sacrifice of the Canadian press. The time has come to relieve the Canadian press of this burden and to follow the example of the BBC and of other leading broadcasters that select, edit, and transmit their own news. The same characteristics of dependability, impartiality, and objective treatment that characterize the Canadian press service are to be maintained, if we can do it. The news of the supplying agencies will be laid down by automatic teletype in the CBC newsrooms at Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver, just as it is laid down in the newsrooms of the local daily papers. The news will be edited and condensed for radio by a staff of experienced newspaper men and women who have been given special training in rewriting news in the radio style, which of course is simple, direct, and conversational. The judgment of the CBC radio editors in each news office will not be hampered by red tape or by unnecessary restrictions.
The news service was formed and staff editors were hired. The first senior editor in Winnipeg was Bill Metcalf.
What we had here were a total of 4, myself,
another writer, and 2 copy boys. The copy boys learned to be writers by being on the job at night when there wasn't much doing, and they'd practice at night and so on, and they'd try to write a little bit of stand-up material for the next day, and they eventually did learn to be writers, one of whom was a fellow you'd know from here, Bert Dentry. The other was a guy called Les Jackson, who finished up with CBC out in Vancouver and in a pretty high job out there. I laugh when I think about Les Jackson because he was the first person that I hired. And he came there, he was only 15 years old, and he had already graduated from high school. He was a smart kid. And at that time, the CBC was paying the magnificent sum of $40 a month for office boys or copy boys. And that surprised me because that was even less than the Winnipeg Free Press paid, and I thought nothing could be less than that. Anyway, I said to Les Jackson, well, look, this job only pays $40 a month. Is that satisfactory to you? And he said, well, that's pretty good for a boy nowadays. And I thought to myself, well, bless you, son. And he turned out great.
How much were you making at the time?
Well, I was doing all right. I'm trying to think. $55 a week. That's what I was hired for. And the Free Press was paying me $37 a week before that. And no way would they ever meet. They never would meet an opposing offer. They'd lose the guy rather than meet an offer.
While the news service went through its initial growing pains, the world went to war. Canada was involved from the beginning. Prime Minister Mackenzie King.
For months, indeed for years, the shadow of impending conflict in Europe has been ever present. Through these troubled years, no stone has been left unturned, no road unexplored in the patient search for peace. Unhappily for the world, Herr Hitler and the Nazi regime in Germany have persisted in their attempt to extend their control over other peoples and countries.
As Canadian troops left for Europe, CBC Radio went too. Frank Willis reports from the Halifax docks.
CBC sound equipment was at the dockside as the troops prepared to embark. We hear the last roll call on Canadian soil. You may catch a name you know.
CBC correspondents went into the field. In London, the first sound engineer for the corporation overseas, Art Holmes, recorded on disc the sounds of the Blitz.
We can always get a good recording done with the docks because this is the first place they would head for to start their trying to cut off shipping of all sorts. And it's just a matter of going down there at night and you're sure to be in the middle of it and get whatever you wanted. I can let you hear a sample of what it was like to be down in this area at that time.
The early London operation. He recalls radio coming of age in competition with print journalism.
You know, they didn't appreciate what radio could do. I remember shortly after I arrived, the King and Queen went out to inspect one of our regiments, and the public relations officer, who was an advertising agency type from Toronto, never told me about it. And I went to him the next day and I protested, and he said, well, what could you do? He thought of radio in terms of Amos and Andy. He didn't know that we could do, you know, these types of broadcasts were like news and that sort of thing. And General McNaughton actually fixed that up for me very well. There was a big inspection, I remember, of the 1st Canadian Division, and it took place in the courtyard of an old castle. And I had our equipment up on a balcony of the castle, and McNaughton was down there with all the troops ready to begin this parade. And he looked up at me, and he yelled up at me, and he said, "Are you ready, Bowman?" And I said, yes, sir. And that's when the parade started. And that fixed us from now on. Then everybody knew that broadcasting was just as important as the newspaper men.
CBC correspondents were in Sicily. Peter Stursberg.
And there they are ringing now, the church bells of Ajira. And now the band under Pipe Major Edmund Essen of Vancouver will play Cabaret.
This is Matthew Halton of the CBC. I don't know how to tell you about Canada's Battle of the Moreau River, which we had hoped would be over before now. It isn't over. The German is fighting to the death, and he opposes us for once in superior numbers of men. Here is just an episode of today. Today again, I went across this valley, Hell's Own, this time on foot, and got forward to one of our companies in the fighting. I got to the top of the ravine on the other side of the Moreau and passed the headquarters of a great regiment, the one which first established the bridge.
They don't know that this barn will soon be shelled and machine gunned. There's Carpiquet. There's the wood from which the Canadian regiments and tanks are going to attack. And here are we, closer to Carpiquet than to the wood. The attack will come across right in front of us and toward us. I've never had a better observation post for a battle, and I dread what I'll see through this door. At 5 o'clock, and it's now about 10 seconds to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Here she goes.
Halton filed well over 600 broadcasts from virtually every theater of the war. Here's another example.
Report number 87, September 30. This is Matthew Halton of the CBC, speaking from Belgium. At the village of Breendonk, a few miles north of Brussels, the Germans had a concentration camp for political prisoners. In this camp, several thousand Belgian and other resistants have been imprisoned at different times during the German occupation. Hundreds of them were tortured and killed in this camp. Before being shot or hanged, each man and woman had to build his or her own coffin. The bodies were taken into Brussels for cremation. Before the victims were murdered, their clothes were taken from them, and these clothes, many of them soaked with blood, were carefully ticketed and put away on shelves in a depot. And you can still see them there if you can bear to go in. Only the Germans could be as obscenely systematic as that.
CBC correspondents like Halton, Stursberg, and Marcel Ouimet were noted for their courage in getting as close to the action as possible. At home, radio brought the war news into the living rooms of the nation. It was presented by people like Charles Jennings, Frank Willis, and when the news always seemed to be bad, a man who became known as the voice of doom, Lorne Greene.
My fetish was to pronounce every word absolutely accurately, particularly the foreign place names, and there were hundreds and hundreds of foreign place names. And when the Germans invaded Russia, the place names became jawbreakers. And one night, and I still don't know to this day whether the head of news wrote this paragraph on purpose or not, just to see if I would stumble. But there were 15 jaw-breaking Russian names. And I went over them very, very carefully. And when I turned the page on the air and I saw this page coming up, I just took a deep breath. And I gave the news, rattling off all these names without hesitation. You know, it was Dnepropetrovsk and Rostov and Volgograd and so on, the Stalingrad and Leningrad and all those the crazy names, particularly in the south. And I went sailed right through it, and sort of breathed a sigh of relief to myself, turned the page over, and the first line contained the words 10-ton trucks. And I couldn't say it. I said, 10-ton
heavily armored vehicles, and went on. But they were marvelous days with tremendous camaraderie.
History records the Allied victory over Germany, in which Canadian troops played no small part. Prime Minister King.
The defeat of Nazi Germany should give us new strength to bring the war speedily to its close in every quarter of the globe. It remains to crush Japanese militarism wherever that treacherous viper continues to raise its venomous head.
It was just 4 years later when a CBC broadcast was interrupted.
To my loved one and
the programs originally scheduled on the Trans-Canada and the Dominion networks of the CBC have been canceled this evening in order that we might broadcast an important address by the Prime Minister of Canada, the Right Honorable Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Prime Minister.
Fellow Canadians, I would like to talk to you tonight about recent serious international developments and of the relationship of our country to them. I am thinking, as you are, more particularly of the communist aggression in Korea. The action of the United Nations in Korea is not war. It is police action intended to prevent war by discouraging aggression. That is why Korea is so important to all of us who want to avoid another world war. And that is why the government at once pledged Canada's support to the United Nations action in Korea. We in the government feel the security of Canada requires further expansion of our own efforts. The government has therefore authorized the recruitment of an additional Army brigade. This brigade will be known as the Canadian Army Special Force.
Hello, I'm Barbara Smith. You're listening to a CBC Radio News special report, The Sound of History. As the 40s ended, a loose end of the country became part of the whole. But on March 31st, 1949, Newfoundland joined Confederation. Joey Smallwood, the first premier and a broadcaster in his own right, credits radio with producing the narrow margin of victory among Newfoundlanders on the referendum that produced Canada's 10th province. Said Smallwood, "I've always contended that God invented radio especially for Newfoundland, and having done it for Newfoundland, he graciously allowed it to be used in other parts of the world." The CBC took over responsibility for the Broadcasting Corporation of Newfoundland. One of the news people involved in the transition was Melvin Rowe.
For the first time in March 1949, we really became conscious and aware of the fact that we were Canadians. And in large measure, I would attribute the CBC and Canadian Press for knitting us as closely as we are with Canada today. Because the Newfoundland people weren't even accustomed to Canadian news. They didn't know what it was. And gradually, by, I suppose, introducing the service to the people, they became consciously aware that we were then a part of Canada.
Through the first years of the radio news service, the man in charge was Dan MacArthur.
This is Ron Robbins in Victoria. I spent nearly 30 years with CBC News. I have some lively recollections of the characters I work with. I was appointed to the news staff by the first chief news editor, Dan MacArthur, a fine journalist and a very warm human being. The radio newsroom was set up in a basement in Jarvis Street in Toronto. Working conditions were appalling. Dan MacArthur had a running battle with Ottawa head office and said he would resign unless air conditioning was provided. And he did resign when head office reneged. But the staff persuaded him to cancel his resignation, and eventually we did get the air conditioning.
MacArthur actually hired me. Another news veteran, based in Halifax, Doug Fraser.
MacArthur says, "Do you know this guy Fraser?" He said, "I understand he's a freelance writer." Max says, "I know him. I think he's a communist, you see. But this time I'm hired, and Dan worries about this for 2 or 3 years till I finally met him." He said, "I'd goddamn Ferguson led me up the garden path." But Dr. Freegan tried to interfere, or tried to question some news coverage, and MacArthur, instead of challenging him quietly, challenged him publicly, and made it stick. Geez, there was a strength and a conviction that MacArthur was running things.
As radio developed, so did expertise in reporting news as it happened. In the mid-50s, the country agonized with the community of Spring Hill, Nova Scotia. The residents suffered through 2 mine disasters and a fire, all within 2 years.
This is Jack McAnder reporting from number 4 colliery at Spring Hill, Nova Scotia. The badge checks of 118 trapped miners hang on the board in the lamp house here at Spring Hill this evening. Around the pit head of number 4 colliery, hundreds of women, children, and relatives are being held back by ropes. Their faces wait for any news of those trapped below. In the mining area, grimy-faced miners huddle and talk over the situation. Though the explosion was heard 42 miles away, many of those working in number 2 colliery did not even feel the tremendous explosion that rocked the mining town at 5 p.m. tonight. A flaming ball of fire rose 1,000 feet in the air, blowing the pit head to shreds and lighting a fire which burned grass and buildings for hundreds of yards. When the mine blew, 3 miners were working at the top of the shaft. One of them was killed instantly, 2 more died in the hospital. One of those killed was blown 300 yards from the pit head. The force of the explosion had blown his clothes completely from his body. At present, the gas that blocks the slope will not allow rescue crews to reach the men. It's a bitter, disheartening job.
And now, News Roundup takes you directly to the scene of the Nova Scotia mine disaster. Come in, Spring Hill.
Here at the pit head at Spring Hill, Nova Scotia, we are still waiting for the first of the miners who were reached alive and well today to come to the surface. The atmosphere here has changed drastically since earlier today. All day long, friends and relatives of those who were entombed beneath the surface of the earth have stood here in the cold, tight-lipped, their faces grim, waiting for some sort of news. And then, a little over 2 hours ago, it was officially announced that a number of the miners were safe. At first, 54 was the number given. And then, just a short time ago, Dr. Lynch, the chief medical officer, told us that 65 of the miners are alive and in apparently good condition. And so there is anticipation here. All is in ready.
Just as Newfoundland's joining Confederation had a unifying effect on the country, so did 2 other projects that got underway during the 50s. The first was the St. Lawrence Seaway. The Seaway opened in 1959 and allowed the resource-rich areas of Western Canada and the United States access to the world marketplace. The CBC marked the occasion with special programming, including live coverage of the official opening, attended by Her Majesty the Queen and President Dwight D. Eisenhower.
This distinguished company has come together from the 2 great countries that border this waterway to mark the completion of a combined operation that ranks as one of the outstanding engineering accomplishments of modern times. We can say in truth that this occasion deserves a place in history.
The Seaway is far more than a technical and commercial triumph. It is above all a magnificent symbol to the entire world of the achievements possible to democratic nations peacefully working together for the common good.
Then, in 1962, Prime Minister Diefenbaker opened the second major land transportation link in the country's history, the Trans-Canada Highway.
This highway, may it serve to bring Canadians closer together. May it bring to all Canadians a renewed determination to individually do their part to make this nation greater and greater still, and worthy of the destiny that the fathers of Confederation had expected when, through their act of faith, they made it possible.
The clash between East and West was highlighted in the first 2 years of the decade by the attempted American invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, and in 1962 by the Cuban Missile Crisis. Doug Fraser was working in the Halifax newsroom during that time.
I think the one that hits most was the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I'd been through the war, and what shocked me was so many of the young people I were working with couldn't comprehend the fact that it was very near a nuclear disaster. But they couldn't comprehend it in a nuclear war, so like Chernobyl is pointed out. It's not just the guys in the front line. It's going to hit home, and everybody's going to make it. And this feeling was there with me. James Menifee, he was sent to Key West, and he was in the football stadium at Key West. And we'd made arrangements that he was to call me with code words to tell me where he was. See, at that time, I was opening the newsroom. Newfoundland was there, but I was the closest link with Toronto. So I had to go in early these mornings, sometimes stay there all night. Anyway, Menifee called me and says, I think we'll be shoving off before too long. And where he was in the football stadium, Key West, for the American invasion of the north coast of Cuba. You know, the forces were massed in Key West. It didn't happen because the Russians blinked. But they were all ready to go, and Menifee was going in as a war correspondent, of course. But it was a close thing, because another few hours, and that would have been on. Who knows what the hell the Russians would have done then. Yeah. And he told me, Menifee had lost an eye in the bombing in London during the war, and he'd been through the First World War as well. And he'd gone to Oxford in the meantime. But he told me, he said it was a close thing. He really thought that this was it. World War III was starting right then and there.
During the 60s, the CBC and the radio news service continued to expand. News was delivered in new formats. The director of CBC Radio was Jack Crane.
When I came into radio in 1964, the 10-minute formats that we had in those days, the country deserved better of us. It just wasn't enough. We had a fear, I suppose, we couldn't fill the time. And we didn't indeed have news on the hour. We had a curious motley of newscasts. There'd be one and there'd be 3 or 4 hours without one. So by the mid-60s, we'd built in the present format where there is news virtually every hour. And then, thanks to Angus McClellan and Charlie Gunning and others, the creation of the World at 6 and the World at 8 formats. That, to me, is the single greatest accomplishment of CBC Radio in those years.
CBC Radio looked to the north and opened new frontiers.
The opening of the stations in Frobisher Bay and Inuvik, Whitehorse and others just lifted a curtain in the north, which I had some experience traveling in the north helping set up those stations. And it was an absolute wall of silence in a Klavik, I remember, in the winter days I was up there. And suddenly to have the air populated by real human voices must have changed the north as much as air transportation or anything else.
One of the people involved when the CBC first set up shop in Whitehorse was Terry Delaney.
We actually started getting news from the network, on the Trans-Canada network, over a telephone line from down south. Very, very poor quality, almost immediately after the CBC took over. We'd carry, several of the major newscasts during the day, and then eventually the CBC locally contracted with the local newspaper, the Whitehorse Star, to provide the daily newscast once a day for the CBC, and that newscast was updated for the morning show. It was used in the evening show and then updated for the morning show. And that went on for a number of years until CBC decided to open up their own news bureau here. And they brought in Bill Morum from Winnipeg. And Bill Morum ran the news service here for 2 or 3 years and got things organized, and it's just progressed upwards ever since.
The 60s ended with man's vision of the heavens changed forever. The space race was on as the two superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, fought for the next headline. In July 1969, these words marked what was possibly the greatest event of the century.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
CBC Radio News broadcast man's exploration of space. Veteran announcer George Rich served as anchor on many of the news specials. He recalls one extraordinary mission.
But one in particular was in 1970, Apollo 13. The voyage to the moon in which a pyrogenic tank exploded between Earth and the moon, and no one really expected the crew to get back. But with what they usually do in those space missions, they were pretty sharp, and they can come up with some cures for almost anything. They did this time. They decided to go onto the moon, finish the 250,000-mile trip, and do what they called a sort of a slingshot around the moon, using the moon's gravitational pull and force to throw them back toward Earth. And that's what they did. And they made it safely back. I never thought they would until they had done that slingshot thing. Since they had no propulsion, they just depended strictly on little jets which aimed the craft rather than propelled it. But they got back safely, and it was an amazing thing, and one I'll always remember for the rest of my life.
Hello, I'm Russ Germain. The titles of news programming changed over the years.
This is Sunday Morning Magazine, a weekly roundup of important news and sports. In this edition, no progress on a Berlin solution. Renewed tension in Southeast Asia. Now, CBC Canadian Roundup with direct reports from across the land.
Good evening. This is The World at 6. From CBC News, Toronto, this is Bruce Rogers, and here are the headlines. There's a new development in the argument over the progressive conservative...
While the names of the programs changed, the voices associated with CBC Radio News continued in the tradition of excellence begun by people like Jennings, Green, Halton, and Stursberg. Two of the prominent personalities through the 50s, 60s, and 70s were James M. Menifee in Washington and Norman Depew.
When the Herald Tribune transferred me to Washington after an inconclusive encounter with a one-ton Nazi parachute bomb, I naturally checked CBC Toronto to see if I couldn't do an occasional piece from Washington. I was covering the White House then, and FDR was providing plenty of material. By good luck, CBC at that time was looking for someone to do just that. Our first office here was a one-room affair shared with Max Friedman, the correspondent then of the Winnipeg Free Press. I had one telephone, a mic on the table in the corner, and half a secretary. I suppose the most outstanding stories I've covered for CBC were the Cuba crisis, which was bedlam, the visit to the United States of Nikita Khrushchev, and finally President Kennedy, his election campaign, his trip to Europe, the last time I saw him when he greeted the Black Watch pipe band on the south lawn of the White House, and his funeral. You might say that there in microcosm was the history of our times. I still can't think of it without emotion. James M. Menifee, CBC News, Washington.
There are the good times, too, though. The warming spectacle of thousands of children cheering their queen, the excitement when you come down out of the night to an airport in a country you've never seen before, the strangeness the first time you see the stars south of the equator, all new constellations with the familiar dipper low on the horizon and the North Star lost to sight. A writer friend of mine, Hugh Garner, once burst into public print saying that newsmen who describe their business as exciting or glamorous are either deluding themselves or lying. As he put it, we really spend 98% of our time checking the correct middle initial of some kook who fell down a well. Well, Hugh, we do at that, but I wouldn't sell the remaining 2% for any other job in the world. This is Norman Depew reporting.
On the Canadian political scene, Trudeau-mania.
The leadership race, which today took a new development with the announcement by Mitchell Sharp that he had decided to opt out and throw his support behind Pierre Elliott Trudeau. The big development on the eve of this convention.
Just as the 60s had belonged to John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson, Canada got a new brand of politician. Pierre Trudeau's Liberals came to power, promising a new era of prosperity. Mr. Trudeau first had to handle a situation that had far greater ramifications than a slow economy or a rise in unemployment. The decade of the 70s began with the country in turmoil. Domestic terrorism, seen before as only a threat, became tragic reality.
Well, it's with shock and consternation, I believe, that all Canadians have learnt of the death of Mr. Pierre Laporte, who was so cowardly assassinated by a band of murderers. And I can't help feeling, as a Canadian, a deep sense of shame that this cruel and senseless act should have been conceived in cold blood and executed in like manner.
It's hard to express oneself in the face of such diabolical savagery. The utter uselessness on their part to have taken such a course indicates how desperate they are and how those feelings, those ordinary feelings that all of us have, compassion, have been buried and destroyed.
The War Measures Act was declared, and Prime Minister Trudeau left no doubt of Ottawa's determination to find those responsible.
There's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a...
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Oh, just watch me.
Two of CBC Radio's reporters on Parliament Hill at the time of the FLQ crisis were Tim Rafe and Peter Laux. They recall the feeling in Ottawa the night Pierre Laporte was found murdered.
It was a very moving experience. There were not a large crowd, 200 to 300, I guess, who'd gathered there, and we talked to them, and I tried to ask them why they were here. This was 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. Why they were here, and there was a group of them, for instance, who had a sign saying, Canada from sea to sea, we love thee. And every now and then they'd break out into singing "Oh Canada" as a symbol of unity, I suppose, of the country can overcome this and let's band together. And this was the feeling you got from it.
Some of these people, were probably there out of curiosity, but so many of them were there out of far deeper feelings. And I sort of, you tend to pride yourself on being tough in this business, but that got to me last night. It got to me interviewing a group of young Canadians, boys and girls, and their attitude, they were almost weeping. This is my country, and how could this possibly happen? What future does it have now? Just a frightening reaction, really a frightening reaction.
The British Trade Commissioner, James Cross, survived his kidnapping ordeal.
I was taken out of the car, told to keep my eyes closed, and a gas mask was put on my head, which the eyepieces had been painted out. I was then driven for approximately 20 minutes and taken out of the car in the garage, led upstairs into a room where I spent the next 60 days.
Mr. Cross was released in return for safe passage to Cuba for his kidnappers and their families. Dave Struthers, our man in Montreal, sums up his feelings.
My reflections on the whole FLQ Cross-Laporte affair is that we are a naive nation. We still have no laws on the books to handle determined street guerrillas, nor do we seem to have people in authority who are tough enough to use the laws when needed. Ruthlessness is never nice to contemplate, but when it is used, the only answer seems to be a similar lack of pity.
Canada wasn't the only country with problems. The United States was caught in the middle of a war it could not win. Vietnam. CBC Radio News sent Mike Duffy to Southeast Asia as South Vietnam was in its death throes.
In 75, having been there once already, Radio News was being swamped because there was just so much happening there. They wanted to send in some reinforcements. And so I was sent over for radio and was there, got out on the last commercial flight the day before the communists arrived.
Tuesday, April 29th. The streets of Saigon, usually jammed with traffic at the morning rush hour, are quiet. The attack by communist aircraft at Saigon's Tan Airport the day before has prompted a 24-hour curfew. With communist forces only a few miles from the center of Saigon, the order to evacuate American nationals is given.
The U.S. suffered through the Watergate affair, which eventually led to President Nixon's resignation in midterm in 1974. Wars erupted in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors. In 1976, the Summer Olympic Games in Montreal put Canada before the eyes of the world. The head of the International Olympic Committee, Lord Killennan.
On behalf of the International Olympic Committee, which awarded the Games to Montreal, I would like to welcome everyone here. First, the individual athletes for whom the games are created. And then the officers and officials of the international federations and National Olympic Committees.
While Montreal celebrated a major international sporting event, the big political question still facing the nation was whether Quebec should stay inside Confederation or separate.
I'm Dan Phelan, Senior Program Editor on The World at 6. In the 1970s, I was in Quebec. The Quiet Revolution, or the so-called Quiet Revolution, had become very noisy. In 1976, the Parti Québécois under René Lévesque came to power. It was a very interesting time in the province. There were a lot of people leaving, most of them English, most of them going to Toronto. In fact, right now in Toronto, you can find a community of expatriates that's quite large. In fact, as large as most Canadian suburbs are. However, there was also a certain feeling of where is Quebec going, because as soon as Lévesque came to power, he promised that there would be a referendum. The referendum had been talked about, but now it was going to happen. This was the referendum that, no matter how it was worded, was going to decide whether Quebec stayed within Canada. The term they chose was sovereignty association. Sovereignty meaning independence, association meaning an association with the rest of the country. But nonetheless, sovereignty equaled independence. There was also a certain reluctance on the part of a number of people on how to deal with this type of story. Was it another case of what does Quebec want? One of the editors working in Toronto at the time, I think, put it very well, that you could not overestimate the potential breakup of a country. However, the referendum was held. The yes side, or the side that wanted to have an independent Quebec with the rest of Canada associated economically, lost. The no side, or what we now call the Federalist side, won. This was a crushing defeat for Lévesque. It was probably the most difficult point in his career. But from 1976 until 1986, not that much has changed when you look at things. Historically, we have had the referendum, but we've gone from Robert Bourassa to René Lévesque and back in Quebec to Robert Bourassa. And here we are 10 years later, and Quebec is still the only province in the country that has not signed the Constitution.
Pierre Trudeau's dream of a Canadian Constitution became reality on April 17th, 1982. The place was Parliament Hill, and once again the Queen took part in an historical event for Canadians.
Let us celebrate the renewal and patriation of our Constitution. But let us put our faith first and foremost in the people of Canada, who will breathe life into it.
Today, I have proclaimed this new Constitution, one that is truly Canadian at last. There could be no better moment for me, as Queen of Canada, to declare again my unbounded confidence in the future of this wonderful country. May God bless and keep you all.
This is Bob Oxley. From the past to the present.
Expo 67 offers perhaps as striking evidence as was ever assembled in one place that the future well-being of the whole world community, the whole world community of man, depends on achieving unity of progress and of peace within the vast diversity of national policies and national goals.
Millions of our fellow citizens will be coming to Vancouver over the next 5 months. From every part of the United States, from around the world, millions more will come to share in this magnificent experience of Expo 86. And we say, come to Vancouver, come to Canada. What a welcome and what a world awaits you here.
Over the past 40-odd years, the Radio News Service has continued to produce hourly, daily, and weekly newscasts and programs, along with special programming like the opening of events such as Expo. Along with the rest of CBC Radio, the news service has attempted to reach more audience at more convenient times while maintaining a high level of excellence. The latest daily network vehicle, just over a year old now, is Canada at 5.
I'm Colin Parker, and I'm still flipping through the Kaplan-Sauvageau report on Canadian broadcasting, which came out several weeks ago. But, lurking in the back of my mind still are some ideas of Marshall McLuhan, who was quoted in the last major study of public broadcasting in 1965. For instance, I liked his reference to the native power of radio to involve people in one another. Well, with that in mind, one of the facts CBC Radio News had to come to grips with when it launched Canada at 5 a year ago, September, is that there's a substantial mobile audience in the late afternoon that might be better served. So Canada at 5 is the first attempt at mounting a major regional news program Monday through Friday. It's a daily slice of Canada at 5.
And how do we compete with print journalism and television? Our chief correspondent, Vince Carlin, spoke with the managing editor of CBC Radio News, Michael Enright, about those aspects and the constant battle for money.
Michael, radio is in transition, and the CBC obviously is in transition in terms of the format, in terms of its mandate. How do you chart a course through that? How does radio find its bearings?
Well, there is in fact no way to conscientiously chart a course when you're faced with two realities. One is a mandate laid down by Parliament that demands that CBC and radio News do virtually everything. And the second reality is no sufficient funding to do that. The problem is a corporate one. We are mandated by the Parliament of Canada, but paid by the Government of Canada. So unless they reduce the mandate or increase the money, we are going to be in this confused situation. As far as Radio News is concerned, we have to, or we go out of business, keep up with all of the technological developments of radio, all of the state-of-the-art bells and whistles and gizmos that allow us to do our journalism fast and accurately and get it to the consumers. And that takes money. And the frustration is the gap between what we do now and what we could do. It's the potentiality that we all see. And we say to ourselves, if only, those are the two words, if only, then we could expand on that solid base that we've built up over the last 40-odd years, 50 years, and take the entire news service to another level in terms of broadcast journalism.
What level is that? What would people see as hallmarks of that level?
Well, radio is, with the exception of print, and I suppose the print novel, is the most intimate form of communication because it creates in the mind of the listener a picture, and we draw word pictures. That's our job. If we had sufficient funding, we could expand that in other areas of the world. We could open up new bureaus, for example, to give a Canadian perspective on foreign news. We could put a national reporter in every province of the country. At the moment, we can't afford to do that. If we could send more people to more things and give them the emotion and the context of an event rather than the facts of the event, I think it would increase the intimacy and the connection between listener and radio.
Now, in the last half of the 50 years that we're talking about, we've seen the rise of television as a provider of information. And from 1960 on, really, the last 25, 26 years, is when television really came into its own in terms of providing some of that emotional impact you talked about, which radio used to do.
Yep.
How does radio still provide that emotion when people can sit down and see an event happening either live before them or in the television equivalent, the videotape instead of the audio tape?
The thing that television, and this is, I mean, everyone says this, but it is true. The thing that television does better than anything else is provide the live pictures of an event as the event's unfolding. What television can't do and radio can is it can fill in the margins. It can provide the context against which you hang the word picture. For example, if you've ever seen, and of course you have, you used to run the place, but television trying to do a budget story or trying to do a story on parliamentary process where there are no pictures or the pictures are static and charts and graphs and so on and little cut pies are used. It's very difficult for TV to do that. Radio can do that. Radio can do it through the writing, through the human voice, and through the understanding and emotion of the reporter doing it. And can come in from the margins. The television camera shows you something, but never shows you what's going on either side of the camera. And that's its strength and its weakness, in my view.
Just as the word processor is replacing the typewriter, more technical changes affecting the way we do our jobs are right around the corner. Tom Holden is an expert in systems engineering at the CBC.
Probably 20 years ago, let's say, or 25 years ago, if we were doing this interview, you would be here today with a technician with a relatively bulky, relatively heavy tape machine that cost $5,000. It required a technician. They were more complicated to operate, for one thing, more prone to breaking down. But what has happened is that these cassette machines became popular enough and cheap enough that a number of broadcasters picked them up. So now you have here a machine which I dare say costs less than $500 and is very familiar to anybody who has reached the age of 12. I'm going to speak about something which could have a parallel or similar impact. It's called RDAT for short. I think it's Rotary Digital Audio Tape Recorder. And there is some prospect of it being introduced this year, this fall. What it is an extremely compact recording device using digital audio technology with quality that is equal to that of the compact disc. The cassette can be recorded on, whereas the compact disc cannot, and they're targeted to be probably in the neighborhood of $1,000 or $1,500 initially.
And what does the future hold for the CBC Radio News Service? The Vice President of CBC Radio is Michael McEwen.
This country's made a choice about how they can get news and information about themselves and about the world, and it's through the kind of service that CBC News has become. I also think it's really important, even maybe more important today than it was in 1936, to have this kind of news service, because we're literally inundated by foreign news sources. And by maintaining our news service and maintaining our commitment to our news service, we provide that very focused Canadian view and Canadian identity. And I think it also helps as a standard for the private sector as well. It develops perspectives, and after all, that's why we're here.
Yeah. Well, we're 50 years old. What's it going to be like 50 years from now, I wonder, if there is a CBC in 50 years? I think there will be. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Of course there'll be a CBC. There will always be, I believe, a public radio service in this country. And in many ways, over the coming, certainly, decade, and, it's difficult to gaze into a crystal ball and say what happens 50 years from now. But over the coming decade, I think Canadians will expect us, and we should come forward with new ideas how to better serve them. And that's our great strength as a public organization. It's characterized our successes in the past, and I think it will characterize our successes in the future.
Throughout this past hour, we've tried to bring you the flavor of our coverage over the years and the way CBC Radio and its news service has helped unite and strengthen Canada. Perhaps the best way to leave the story is to go back to one of those people who fought so hard for a public radio service from the beginning in the 30s, the co-founder of the Radio League, Graham Spry.
If you want a Canadian society, if you want to live in a group of people you call your fellow citizens, the Canadians, then you must have information about that community and about each other, about the different regions, of course, but about the community of all regions as a unity. You don't have a curling match by just whirling your stone around at one end. You've got to use the whole ice.
The sound of history. 50 years of news broadcasting on CBC Radio was written, edited, and produced by Dick Vanells. Research by Marnie Coulter, with special thanks to the CBC Archives Department. Technical production by Victor Johnston. Everyone has his or her own stories and recollections, and we apologize to the literally hundreds of writers, editors, reporters, and on-air staff we weren't able to mention. CBC Radio News has been and remains the best radio news service in the country because of its people. For CBC Radio News, this is Bob Oxley speaking.